A few years ago, I was given this copy of the prose poem Desiderata by Max Ehrmann. This is a lovely illustrated version that has some nice images to go along with those particular words. Some of you will be familiar with this poem, which is really a collection of wisdom statements. It's a little bit of its time, that time being 100 years ago when it was first written, but it's one that lots of us connect with, or at least connect with different parts of over the course of our lives. The poem was largely unknown in the writer's lifetime, and that's not too surprising given that really he wrote this for himself. He wrote it as a letter to himself to encourage the virtues he felt most in need of. It is the second line of the poem that has taken on greater meaning for me in recent years. As I say, it was quite a long reading, given that I apparently only get to the second line of it and go, oh, that's the one I'm going to think about, but this is the one that sticks out for me. That line was, "As far as possible." It's a good beginning to a sentence. It's quite reasonable. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. As I say, lots of the lines do stick out at us at different times in our lives, but this is the virtue I often feel most in need of. I'm not naturally inclined to be on good terms with all persons. Like many of you, I have had bust-ups, misunderstandings with several people over the course of my life. And certainly when I was younger, I had a terrible habit of really hanging on to the hurt. I know how to nurse a grudge. But the reason that this line of this poem stands out for me is really to do with a significant part of ministry, and that is the ministry of funerals. Funeral ministry is a privilege as well as a challenge. There is something profound about walking with others in a time of grief, even if only for a short time. Sometimes these journeys are marked by moments of joy or laughter or even happiness mixed in with those complicated feelings of sadness and loss. Less often, and I'm pleased that this is the case, funerals can come with regrets and hurt for opportunities missed or problems left unresolved. Such experiences are what highlight for me the wisdom of those words, as far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Years ago, in Wellington, there was an appliance store owner who was one of the first people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to make use of regional advertising. That's an important point because if I simply launched into saying, hey, don't you all remember these particular advertisements? The answer is probably most of you would not, because you will have grown up in other parts of the world or even other parts of the country. Anyway, I remember these particular advertisements well because I remember the slogan, which clearly that's what slogans are for. It's memorable. All these years later, almost 40 years later, in fact, I still remember the slogan. In each of these ads, the business owner would simply state how no matter what happened to an appliance you had purchased from him, if there was any problem at all, you only needed to bring it back and they would fix it, replace it, or refund your money. This was in the time before the Consumer Guarantees Act, where such service was not to be expected in all places. Then came the slogan, "Because it's the putting right that counts." All of these ads finished with the words, "It's the putting right that counts." It's not quite as poetic as the line about being on good terms with all persons, but there is a certain wisdom to these words as well. The restoration of relationships was a defining aspect of the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was very much about the putting right. For example, the healing ministry of Jesus ran much deeper than the physical. In the ancient world, and as we have actually also experienced in recent times, there was a certain wisdom to separating people with contagious illness from the wider community. Separating sick people from healthy people can protect the healthy. It is an equation that affirms that no individual is more important than the well-being of the community as a whole. But of course, as many of us will remember from our experience of lockdowns, there is a price. There is a price in terms of separation from loved ones. Many of us had those experiences of not being able to be with people we cared about when they were ill or dying or had their funerals. In biblical times, however, there was an added dimension to such practices of exclusion to protect the community. And that was that often people who were non-contagious or had lifelong illness or disability were cast out from the community with no pathway back. It was a one-way trip with no care and ongoing exclusion. There is no doubt that the exclusion of sick people was incredibly damaging to those individuals as well as their families. Where there is division, there is pain. And this was the social context into which Jesus offered healing. Jesus was not simply healing people who were sick. Jesus created opportunities to restore those who had been cast out back to their families, back to their community. It was a revolutionary statement that said, "We are better together." There are times in our church history where the practice of reconciliation and restoration to a community has been practiced more intentionally than we do today. On Ash Wednesday, the day that begins the season of Lent we are currently in, traditional services often begin with a summary of the different Lenten traditions that have shaped our understanding of this season. One of those lost traditions was that Lent was a time when people who had been excluded from church communities could demonstrate a desire to return to the church community. These excluded people had typically committed some sort of crime and were therefore not permitted access to the sacraments of the church. For example, they could not receive forgiveness and they could not share in communion. Often, in fact, these people were not even permitted to enter the church, but rather were encouraged to show their remorse by gathering in the entranceway during services. Now, on the face of it, this sounds rather harsh, except that people were not left in this place of exclusion. By demonstrating their desire to return to church during the season of Lent, these people were welcomed back into the community as part of the celebration of Easter. And that makes a rather poetic kind of sense, seeing as how Easter is a celebration of new life, new beginnings. At Easter, those who had been excluded would receive forgiveness, they could receive communion, and in this way, they would be fully restored to their community. What a powerful way of affirming that divine forgiveness is always offered and is always absolute. So where does that leave us? Perhaps we need to think of those excluded from full participation in our society today, because there are people who experience such exclusion. For example, how do we as a community treat those who have served time in one of our nation's prisons? We still have an incredibly punitive attitude towards those who commit crime in this country. And while we can understand the pain experienced by the victims of crime, as followers of Christ, we cannot acquiesce to a mentality of lock them up and throw away the key. Can you imagine a news story here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that celebrated the release of one of our prisoners? I would love to hear such a story, but it feels incredibly far-fetched. And yet that is something we should be doing. Those who have served their time should be greeted with the joy expressed by the parent in the story of the prodigal child. This child who was lost has been found. You have served your prison term, and now we welcome you back. I think we have a long way to go for such a dream to become a reality. The restoration of relationships is not only vital and important for our community, it is incredibly significant in our personal relationships. Most of us can think of people who have disappeared from our lives. We may have excluded them. They may have excluded us. One thing I have learnt about relationship breakdown is that the responsibility for the breakdown seldom falls on just one person. Now, I'm not encouraging you to open up old wounds. Sometimes relationships need to end for reasons of health or safety. These are not the situations I am speaking to. What I am encouraging you to think about is a relationship that deep down you might want to repair. Think about it. And if you are brave enough, maybe take this opportunity to do something. Because it is possible that it is the putting right that counts.